paper was published and basically an hour later labor started.
Relief.
Science sisters, they're here to talk.
How do you get a good research idea?
Very stressful because it also depends on who else is behind it.
It's not me alone. There's a lot of support.
Contact is and for fellowship applications, early on. Well, you just need to have a lot of luck.
Science sisters, let's start the show.
Hello and welcome to the last episode of Science Sisters this season. I'm your host Iris and today I'm once again in London, joined by Paula Koelemeijer this time. She did her PhD at Cambridge and then did some postdocing at ETH, Oxford, University College London, and now she's managed to get a permanent position here at Royal Holloway, University of London. Thank you so much for talking to me.
You're welcome.
One of the topics I would like to cover today, regardless of what you would like to cover, is how did you manage to get your permanent position? Because obviously, I imagine, there's fellowships, writing proposals, but that's far off from getting an actual permanent position.
So in my case, writing fellowships and getting quite a large fellowship has enabled me to get this permanent position. So I applied to several large fellowships, 5 years salary funding plus research funding and perhaps some other funding. And I got these in 2018 and I started them at University College London. There's already quite a large seismology group there, and personally I wasn't that interested in living in the centre of London, and my other half is based more outside London. So I started looking around where could I be based with my fellowship to kind of establish ourselves and settle. I started talking with the Royal Holloway about this because having a fellowship means that you can transfer them to a different university while you would bring 4 or 5 years funding with you. So this is very beneficial to a university if you would be hosted there and transfer your funding there. Royal Holloway didn't have any global seismologists, so it was kind of a natural place to have discussions with them and see whether I could move my fellowship.
So how long does it take to write such a big fellowship? Because I've tried a couple of times to look up what I had to do, and every time I feel so intimidated. I'm like, well, maybe next time.
It depends. Some fellowships are faster than others. Some are like 1,000, 2,000 word proposal, which is not too bad. But the thought process behind the fellowship takes much longer because you need to think of research ideas, you need to talk with people of what they think of these research ideas. You might want to have partners on the project. That whole process can take a long time. But also, in order to submit a fellowship application, you generally need to do all the financial aspects of a fellowship, and you need to do official budgeting. You can't do that yourself. You need the university to do this for you. So you actually need to have contact with the university so that they do the budgeting, they approve the budget before you could even submit the fellowship application. So a few months at least you need for this process. Also, to be able to write a draft, put it aside, and look at it again later on. Yeah. Not that I have done that in every case, but that's what you should do. So I would say a few months at least, and it's useful to make contact early on with the university. If you want to be based somewhere, contact the head of department and say, would you support my fellowship application? Because certain universities will also first have internal procedures. Because of the number of fellowships that you might be allowed to submit to the funder, you sometimes have internal competitions first at a university. And that can be 5-6 months before the official deadline. Right. So you often need to make contact quite early. It is useful early on to have contact and to discuss which fellowships could I apply for, are there internal deadlines, and get the budgets done besides all the research idea aspects and writing all the other parts of the application, because often there's very long online forms that you have to fill in that you should not only get to the night before you submit.
So would you recommend, if you are interested in applying for a fellowship somewhere, to contact the head of the department, or as I've been doing it so far is contact a professor or a PI who I could attach myself to, since whenever I was thinking about it, I can't apply for the 5-year fellowships yet, but the more junior ones.
I think with the more junior ones, so 2-3-year fellowships, I would contact a PI. With the more independent 5-year fellowships, I would contact the head of department, or if you know someone in a university, maybe use that person to make contact.
Right.
But generally, the head of department and then research services within the university will work with you.
That is good to know. This is like my sneaky plan for I now have my DLR kind of job for 2 years, and then I will have 3.5-4 years of junior postdoc experience. So
but then you can apply to the larger fellowships.
Exactly, that would be the time at which. Now I just need a brilliant idea to write about. But
Yeah, and that's the hard aspect of how do you get a good research idea?
Yeah, and also one that is, has clear boundaries and you already know the steps. Because if you have a very brilliant but vague idea, that's obviously also not going to happen.
It depends a little bit. For some of the 5-year fellowships, you generally have to give quite a clear idea for the first 3 years of the work, but then more of a research vision for the rest, because they do understand that you do not necessarily know exactly what will happen. So you can have a research idea, talk about in detail about the first few years what you will do, and then give potential follow-up projects that can lead on from the research you're proposing. And that could then turn into PhD projects, perhaps, or master's project or postdoc projects. So you try and think about that as well. It's very useful in general to have one large-scale research question, but that has multiple angles to it, so that they can be relatively independent research projects that all fall under one larger big-scale research question.
The actual real proposal that I have in mind with my research questions is still this blinking cursor on a white page.
So what I often do, you don't get a research idea when you sit behind your desk and think, I need to write this research proposal. That's not how it works. You need to have time to think creatively when you're walking, when you're chatting with people at conferences, when you're cycling. And so what is quite useful to do is when you're at conferences and people give you suggestions about your poster or your presentation, they might be tiny little ideas, but write them down and keep them together, try and have them together somewhere. And over time, there might be like a kind of common theme emerging that you can use for future research grant applications.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
because often ideas come from some imperfection in your methods or some imperfection in your data, and so writing down all these little ideas, and at some point things fall together.
But yeah, you managed to get your permanent position, so that is amazing.
So at the moment I'm funded by my fellowship, and then after my fellowship it transitions to a lectureship.
So how long after your PhD, exactly how many years was it until you nailed your permanent position or research fellowship with prospects of permanent?
I finished my PhD in 2014, and I applied for the bigger fellowships in 2017 because 1 year later my funding for my postdoc would be running out, and then was successful for NERC and the Royal Society. So I started the fellowship 4 years after my PhD.
That's pretty quick.
I wasn't expecting to get them because NERC it was the first year I could apply, I think, that I got it. And I was very relieved about because I didn't have funding after that year either. Generally it's more wise to apply while you still have another year funding left than when you know you're running out of funding.
Yeah, makes sense. Which, if you have 2-year contracts, means that as soon as you start,
you need to apply. Yes,
which is freaking me out.
And it's very stressful. Yes. One advantage of starting to do applications is that any new application, you reuse so much of your old material.
Yeah.
Even now, I have a stable position here. For any grant application, I will reuse so much material from previous fellowship applications and grant applications.
Yeah.
Even if you don't get a fellowship, it is not entirely wasted. You will reuse it a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is also why I applied for Utrecht at that point, because I'd never written a teaching statement because you don't need to. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get this job, but now I'll at least force myself to write
everything. And then you reuse these for other applications.
It will get better because first time is not too great. But
yeah, definitely.
Then you have a starting point.
I've done the same. I reuse lectureship applications because I applied to a number of lectureships while I was also applying to fellowships and had to write all the research statements, like teaching statements, and renewed them, changed them, altered them based on older ones. It's just a shame that you often don't get feedback about what you should change.
Yeah, I think you're pretty good at writing fellowships because you're getting a lot of them.
I think part of it's being organized and diligent and making sure to read the spreadsheets, making sure to read the notes of the schemes in a lot of detail and paying attention to all the aspects of the application, not just the research proposal, but also all the other aspects. And a lot of luck in the end as well, because there's been cases where people apply to the Royal Society and are interviewed 1 year and don't get it and apply with roughly the same next year and don't get even interviewed because it also depends on who else is applying that year.
Right, yeah, that's true.
It's not just your application. They have a certain amount of funding available. They will go to the top 10, 20, 30 applications, but it also depends on who else is applying that year. And the details of those applications, because of the budgets, maybe they can fund certain fellowships that are slightly smaller in terms of the research funding that they're applying for.
Yeah.
There is in the end a lot of luck involved as well.
I think that's been one of the main red threads throughout this whole Science Sisters thing. Everyone's saying, well, you just need to have a lot of luck. And somehow it kind of...
You need a lot of luck. And support from a network at some point. I had a lot of people proofread applications. I've talked with a lot of people. I had a lot of science friends who are not earth scientists read through as well and give me...
Oh, that's useful for those big panels.
For panels that are more interdisciplinary,
exactly.
It's useful to have people read through your application and research proposals who are not neuroscientists. They'll ask you questions like, why do you assume that? Because that's not clear to me, whereas to me that might be a normal assumption to do. Particularly for my interview, when I was going for interview, I had 2-3 friends read through my proposal who were not earth scientists and tell me, like, what would you ask questions about? What isn't clear or what is vague? And having another half who proofreads a lot of applications.
Also useful.
Who is an earth scientist but not a deep earth seismologist,
yeah.
but knows about earth science from another aspect. I get a lot of help from proofreading materials. So over time you build a support network, both academic and personal, that help a lot as well.
Yeah.
It's not me alone. There's a lot of support from an academic support network, from a personal support network, and from the university who will help with the financial aspects, but also I did, before my interviews, I did practice mock interviews in the university at UCL, and they were really helpful with setting up mock interviews, asking me questions. So since the first interviews in 2013, I wrote down a list of questions and I wrote down the answers to the list of questions as well. But then I printed it out, stood up, not sitting down as well, not sitting behind my desk, but standing up as if I was somewhere physically where I would have to answer the questions and saying out loud the questions. And every interview since I've done that. And my list of questions get longer and longer and longer that I can prepare for. But practicing them out loud is one of the tips I give to a lot of people as well, because you will always say things differently than how you think of them in your head or how you write them down. Things will not come out as nicely as you've imagined them, generally.
No, exactly. But
so it's useful to practice saying them out loud and to think of a list of useful questions.
Also, two things I think are very important but might be underestimated. Ask your own questions. So I also always prepare a list of questions. And they're not very in-depth, super technical questions because I get quite nervous about that, but I'll be like, well, what's the group like? And also, one thing I always do, although it's terrifying, is before actually applying, emailing with, hi, I saw this, I'm very interested, and just have minor questions on
but that's important, I think.
Especially if you don't know them yet, to establish a certain base relationship.
Yes, because you have the formal application, but you would say the same to PhD students, like email the supervisor before you submit an application, because you need to get a feel for what the person is like. Can you work with them, especially if you're working 3-4 years together? Can you work with this person? And indeed, asking questions yourself is really important. So any fellowship interview, any lectureship interview, I will have a set of questions I can ask.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you always get the question at the end, do you have any questions for us? Exactly. And it is useful to have some answers, to have some questions ready.
Yeah. And it's also, then it becomes more of a conversation rather than a one-sided interview where you're on the spot.
And it can always be questions that you roughly know the answer to already.
Yeah.
But still have some questions.
Yeah, show some interest yourself.
You can steer them towards aspects that might come up in the interview.
Yeah.
Often I might have asked something about outreach or teaching training or
exactly.
things like this, which might not come up in the conversation, but you can ask about.
Yeah, those are things exactly that are also on my list. Because it makes sense, because those are very valuable skills that you have, and you might as well alert them to it, and also wonder if you can still do them, because it's something you're passionate about.
Yeah.
And especially in the initial emailing phase of saying hi, and they can also help you with the application. For example, when I applied to DLR, I would ask, so what coupling of the codes exactly do you have in mind? Which codes are we talking about? This is all not clear from the very general statement. And then
you can write your application more specific.
Yeah, exactly. And then you already, I got some papers like this will kind of be what it's like, and I'm like, okay, so now I actually know what I will be applying to, so I can make it more specific, and it makes more sense.
Yeah. Definitely make contact with whoever is advertising the application or job, whether you're a PhD student or postdoc or as applying to a lectureship. Make contact with the department.
Contact is the most important thing.
And for fellowship applications, early on.
Early contact. Yeah, you got a baby about a year ago, I guess.
Yeah, Lisa turned 1 at the end of July.
Oh. So, how has that been going? How was it to be on leave for so long, and now that you're back? Is that different? Is it difficult? Is it not difficult?
First of all, I think I've been very fortunate that my pregnancy and then Lisa as a baby were quite easy in terms of sleeping a lot during the day the first few months. That helped, particularly the first few months, to not feel that separated from work, perhaps. Quite early during the pregnancy, I started working from home and then was at home with Lisa for, I took off about 8.5 months after the birth. She was quite straightforward, so that enabled me to continue some of the fun aspects of academia. I didn't do much of the admin side of things and I didn't do any teaching, but I continued certain research projects because she allowed me to do that. So in a way, it has been easier the first few months of leave than the last few months when I've been back at work and have a lot of things to catch up with in terms of admin, particularly. Working and juggling a shorter working day than I would like to have with all the responsibilities I have at work and at home. One useful aspect of my fellowship is that it allows me to change to part-time working.
Okay. Not all fellowships have that?
I think the larger fellowships will have it.
Okay.
I have started working 80% since coming back from maternity leave. So since April, I've been working at 80%, and I have Fridays off with Lisa, and the other 4 days she goes to nursery, and that's been nice. I feel a bit less guilty of bringing her to nursery 4 days a week because I know that we have 3 days a week at home together. But we still have a shorter working day because we don't like having her in nursery really early in the morning and until really late in the evening, and we want to have dinner together as a family.
So what times does she go to the nursery?
So he generally drops her off in the morning. It was around 9:15. Now we're moving to about 8:15. And then I pick her up around 5, just before 5, which we think is already quite a long day for her at nursery. But then we can have dinner at home. And we have breakfast together at home as well in the morning. Whereas it is possible also for babies to have breakfast at nursery, apparently.
Oh, wow.
Perhaps it's a more Dutch mentality that I'm quite keen to have breakfast together and dinner together and not have her at nursery for those meals. But it means that my working day is a bit shorter because I try and pick her up before 5. And that gives some pressure on being efficient during the day.
Yeah, less procrastination.
Less procrastination, more efficient working. I didn't take any time off before the birth. I might have been still busy with work after labour started.
I do know quite some people in academia who've been like that.
The plan was to take 2 weeks off before the due date in terms of annual leave. So not to have the maternity leave start before the birth, but have 2 weeks of annual leave. But then some exciting work came up. We had a paper coming out with a lot of media interest, so I was busy with that. And then Lisa decided to come a bit more than a week early. The paper was published and basically an hour later labour started.
Relief. Oh.
From one thing to the other.
Yeah. My supervisors went on a lot of maternity leaves during my PhD. And we kind of fell into this void of they were very much the daily supervisor you would talk to. And then obviously they wouldn't have that much time, especially once the second kid came along, because I can't imagine how busy that is. We were kind of left to our own devices, which was fine most of the time, but we did kind of wonder, wouldn't it have been great or better if there was some kind of middle person who also was very involved in the project and then could kind of take over an intermediate postdoc or something.
Yes.
Although, of course, maybe there's no money to hire such a person.
I think the funding issue is the most important problem. It's a problem there. Generally, universities tend to have some funding available to cover teaching duties. Not so much supervising duties. Probably one reason is that officially every PhD student in the department has 2 supervisors in the department already.
Yeah.
So that technically there is another supervisor. They just lack the research expertise. If the group is large enough to have a postdoc who works on similar aspects, then in practice that person will be taking over research supervision. And I've had that during my PhD when my supervisor went on maternity leave. In my case, during my leave, because I've only started at this university recently, there isn't a large group yet that could support each other. And that has made it more tricky.
Well, this was very insightful. I am very excited to write a fellowship now. It's always in the back of my mind. It just needs to get to the front, but it's very slow.
Start with if you can, start with the shorter ones.
Yeah.
Get some experience with the shorter ones before you do a large one.
Yeah.
Or do the Royal Society one where the proposal is 3 pages.
That does sound good.
But there is a lot more to the application.
Okay. Great.
But the proposal itself is only 3 pages.
Thanks to you for watching. I don't know how long the video will be. It'll be quite...
We can cut loads.
Yeah. It'll be quite a job. Yeah, so thanks for watching Science Sisters. If you liked it, like the video and subscribe. Maybe there will be a season 2 if you like it and if I have time. It's probably the bigger chance.
Maybe in a different country.
Yeah, this is the UK season.
Ja.
How exciting.
Wir können auch Deutsch sprechen.
No, we cannot. Anyway, we were saying goodbye. Sidetracked once again. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Maybe I will see you in the next Science Sisters. And until then, bye!
Bye!
I think this went great.
Because I can use all my props.
Yeah. There we go. So, what are these props, Paula? I get this weird feeling that you want to say something about them. This is not so much an interview for the rest as it is for me. Yes, I will do that.